Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ty and today we're going to revisit one of my favorite games that never released, which is Yager's Dead Island 2. We all know the 2023 one by DltaStudios that actually did release, but this one was in development far before, and since 2021, damn, it's been a long time, I've been exploring an alpha build of the game from 2015, which mysteriously leaked. And well, with the recent news about Dead Island 3 being in development with a 2028 release, yeah, it's gonna be a while, I think it's about time we jump back into Dead Island 2 2015 to not only appreciate what the game does well, but also talk about what would be great to see return in Dead Island 3. Now, as you can see, the game is pretty damn different from what we got, but one thing I don't believe I've touched on before, which I do believe makes a big difference, is the vehicle variety, which there is a lot of. Like, it's cool to see things like a golf cart, different types of cars, and tons of vehicles you would actually see accessible in a city. This game is very much like if Dead Island, Dead Rising, and Borderlands had a secret love child that was, well, abandoned, and that's something we're actually going to dive into today. A lot of what went down behind the scenes, and normally when I revisit this build, I mess around, explore what it has to offer in terms of differences, like all the unique weapons, which I'm sure many would be fine with just seeing, but I wanted to switch it up this time and actually talk about the downfall of this game and why it ended up the way it did. And thanks to Game Informer, we do know why. The article is a few years old but has multiple former developer interviews that gives us some insight into what went down. Alright, so let's start from the beginning, the reason why Yager was picked to develop the game to begin with, and that was because, according to Game Informer, Deep Silver sent out a request for studios to send over a game proposal and Yager sent the lowest bid. So, they got the job. They estimated around 85 to 100 people worked on the game, and then they go on to also mention what would have been the tutorial section, and that is San Francisco. As you can see, it's actually part of this build, and it's pretty straightforward how it starts. You wake up next to a sinking plane, like what happens in the modern version of Dead Island 2. But in the story, we eventually end up in Malibu, and then we end up in the Redwoods, which we've unfortunately never had a chance to see. San Francisco is easily the most complete section in the build, however there are some pretty big technical issues that we'll talk about more in a moment. I know technical issues are to be expected with a leaked build that appeared out of nowhere, but this actually plays into what went down behind the scenes with the development. So one thing Game Informer brings up is sort of the beginning of the end, and that's multiple people that worked on the project reported a big change in focus of the entire game. Instead of being a 4-player story-driven co-op game like the original Dead Island, it was made into an 8-player always-online multiplayer game, which is honestly crazy, but I'm not surprised, to be honest. Especially in this day and age, they were getting ahead of the curve with that one. It's really sad, but when you look at it, so many good single-player focused studios have been forced to make a random multiplayer game at some point in their life, and it never usually goes too well. So many parts of the game would have stayed in place like the levels made, but the core point of the game was shifting as the publisher wanted, and I quote, seamless multiplayer. Another major roadblock during the development is the engine they used, which is Unreal Engine 4. Yager actually wanted Dead Island 2 to be more of an open world game, but the engine was just not good with that sort of thing, to the point where it just had problems trying to get it running on consoles. A lot of the engine issues they go on to list are actually things I've run into when playing this build before, like a majority of buildings not appearing in San Francisco, popping textures, consoles, and I guess my PC just weren't able to keep up with it. But in all seriousness, I do think my issues more span from this being a ripped build from, well, somewhere. Later on in development, the creators of the engine Epic offered support, but Yager just kept missing milestone after milestone, and there just weren't enough people on Yager's team to do what they needed to do. Deep Silver eventually sent on engine architects from the developers of Saints Row to take a look at the issues, and they straight up said, yeah, you need to build this shit from scratch. And that is when the sirens began to go off at the studio. And from my understanding, soon after, the development was passed on to Sumo Digital, which also didn't go very well. That one we don't really know much about besides some pieces of concept art that show some Dead Rising style vehicles with weapons attached. I did make a full video on it in the past if you're interested. The article also mentions they plan on dividing the bigger locations like Los Angeles and probably the Redwoods into smaller maps, and they said Los Angeles would have had like 4. Malibu is the only playable section in the build, however there is gameplay footage from Gamescom and things like that which shows off a neighborhood style map, and is a much better representation of how the game actually is supposed to look when it's not, you know, a visually buggy mess. I'm not sure what it is though, but this game has a lot of charm to it, at least to me. Like maybe not the writing, it's silly to a point where I can't take anything that they're saying seriously at all, but the actual vibe of the world, the music, I see what they were trying to do here, I get the vision. I did see one video online a couple years ago where somebody actually got multiplayer in this build working. I'm not sure how, but it does seem to be a possibility, and maybe it was played locally, I don't really know. But on the off chance that somebody out there does know the answer, feel free to let us know how down below. Every time I play this build, I do feel obligated to talk about one of my favorite things that I just feel like is such a standout, and that is the weapon variety. There are just so many unique special weapons that I'm surprised I haven't seen in any other game before. Like, I hate to say this about the modern version of Dead Island 2, you know, Dambuster's version, but the weapon variety is just alright, you know, there's nothing super special that really makes me think back to it. Whereas this game has 2 or 3 weapons that I would just straight up call iconic, and I think they knew that because they used them on a lot of the marketing material. These are the sort of crazy ass weapons I wish we saw more often. Like, I get if maybe this is a step too far for some people, but I honestly respect them going more bombastic and wild with their design choices. Like, instead of just having a chainsaw, which they do also have, they added a weed whacker to it. And I actually got a little physical version of that I got in a collector's edition for this game. It's pretty cool. Yes, this game was so far along that they even had a collector's edition ready. Another thing this game does that I hope Dead Island 3 incorporates is dual wielding. It really does add a whole new layer of replayability to it, just allowing you to use one weapon to shock and one weapon to stab, and just the different player and weapon combinations would have been nice to mess around with. And a good place to mess around with them at, which I've showed throughout the video, is this testing zone, which allows you to switch between characters, see all the different weapons, including actually DLC weapons too. And you can spawn in every enemy type, including the humans. You don't often find these guys out in the open world outside a few scripted missions, so this is probably the best way to show them off. What's kind of fun is you can spawn as many of these guys as you want, so you could straight up create wars between all the zombies and humans. Spawn a couple of these monstrosities, which are called stompers. They're basically the ram from the first Dead Island, but without their straitjackets, and throw in like 10 doses of horse tranquilizers. They're pretty fun to go against. Anyways, to end it off, let's go back to the very beginning. This was our first ever look at gameplay for Jaeger's Dead Island 2, showing all of the playable characters, including 2 that weren't available in the alpha build. It also dives into some of these stories, showing how the events of the first game, and yes, Riptide, transpired into the virus spreading to California. And I'm talking about the whole state of California, not just LA like what was quarantined off in Dan Buster's Dead Island 2. They got the whole state this time. Then, at the very end, they show a small snippet of gameplay just to put into perspective how far that version of the game evolved. Even though it never fully released, Jaeger's version of Dead Island 2, it still does a lot right. And hopefully, knowing Dead Island 3 is in the works, Dan Buster is a little bit more open to being a little bit more ambitious with it like this game tried to be. It wasn't really feasible a decade ago, at least with them, but it all certainly is now. With that said, that's our yearly playthrough and conversation about Jaeger's version of Dead Island 2. It was nice to get some development history thrown into there this time to spice it up, and if you want to know more about this game, then simply let me know down below in the comments. Feel free to subscribe because, well, why not, man? We do some cool stuff here, and have a good one, folks. Adios.